In the spring of 2003, while most of the world had its eyes fixed on the opening days of a war, a small research team was quietly walking careful grid lines across the cracked, sun-baked earth of southern Iraq, pushing a lightweight instrument slowly over ground that hadn't held a living city in roughly 4,000 years. They weren't soldiers, and they weren't treasure hunters. They were carrying a magnetometer, a device that reads faint magnetic disturbances buried beneath soil, capable of tracing the ghost of a wall, a canal, or a foundation without disturbing a single grain of earth. As they moved across the dust of the site the ancients called Uruk, the readings slowly assembled themselves into something extraordinary. Streets, canals, garden plots, the outline of an enormous buried metropolis, mapped without a shovel ever touching the ground. But one shape in particular, tucked inside the trace of an old, silted-over channel of the Euphrates River, would go on to capture imaginations for the next 2 decades. A rectangular structure, clearly deliberate, sitting almost exactly where a 4,000-year-old text claims the greatest hero of the ancient world was laid to rest. That hero was Gilgamesh, and what follows isn't really the story of a discovery. It's the story of an ancient account and a modern instrument both pointing, 40 centuries apart, at the very same patch of ground, and what happened, and didn't happen, in the years after that alignment came to light. So a headline like "The Tomb of Gilgamesh has finally been found" is worth examining honestly, because it isn't quite accurate, and the real story turns out to be more genuinely interesting than that overstated version anyway. To understand why a rectangular smudge on a magnetic survey map became such a big deal in the first place, you first need to understand who Gilgamesh actually was, and what the ancient poem bearing his name says about how he was buried. Gilgamesh is the central figure of the oldest surviving substantial work of literature humanity has produced, older than Homer, older than the biblical texts, older than nearly everything else still commonly read today. The epic that carries his name was originally written in cuneiform script on clay tablets, some of which crumbled and had to be painstakingly reassembled by scholars piecing together fragments recovered over generations of archaeological work. It tells the story of a king who ruled the city of Uruk, a real and extensively excavated ancient city whose ruins still sit today near the modern site known as Warka in southern Iraq. In the poem itself, Gilgamesh is no ordinary man. He's described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a figure of towering size and restless strength so extreme that his own people begged the gods to create a rival capable of matching him. That description is the literary root of what would later grow into the popular idea of Gilgamesh the Giant. It's worth being precise here, because this distinction matters enormously later on. The epic's description of Gilgamesh's superhuman size is a feature of the literature itself, the same kind of poetic exaggeration later mythic traditions apply to their own heroes, describing them as impossibly tall or impossibly strong. It's a literary detail, not a forensic one, and keeping that distinction clear becomes essential once we get to the images that have circulated online claiming to show an actual giant skeleton pulled from the sand. The epic follows Gilgamesh through friendship, grief, and eventually a desperate, ultimately failed search for immortality. He befriends a wild man named Enkidu, shaped from clay by the gods, and the two undertake a series of dangerous adventures together. When Enkidu dies, the loss breaks something fundamental in the king. For the first time, Gilgamesh truly understands that he too will die, that even a being described as 2/3 divine must eventually be lowered into the earth. He wanders in search of a legendary flood survivor said to have been granted eternal life, hoping to learn the secret of immortality for himself, and in the end, he fails. The plant capable of restoring youth slips from his grasp, stolen by a serpent while he sleeps. Gilgamesh returns home to Uruk and accepts the one truth he cannot escape. He will die like every other person who has ever lived. That's the genuine emotional core of the oldest substantial story we possess. A powerful king forced to confront his own mortality and lose that confrontation completely. But there's one specific detail in the ancient tradition surrounding Gilgamesh's death that has quietly drawn treasure hunters and dreamers to southern Iraq for well over a century. And it's the exact detail that makes the 2003 survey so genuinely striking. According to fragments of the broader Gilgamesh textual tradition describing events after his death, the people of Uruk did something remarkable to honor, and effectively hide, their fallen king. They dammed the Euphrates, diverting the river out of its natural course and draining a section of the channel until the riverbed lay fully exposed. There, in the mud where flowing water had been only days before, they built his tomb, a structure raised directly in what had briefly become dry riverbed. Once construction was finished and the king sealed inside, they broke the dam and let the Euphrates flow back over everything, so that the river itself became a permanent guardian, placing the tomb somewhere no ordinary grave robber could ever reasonably reach. The water conceals the tomb. The water protects the king. For roughly 4,000 years, that passage was generally read as beautiful poetic imagery, a hero symbolically returned to the elements, until a magnetometer pushed across a dry, ancient channel of that same river returned the outline of a genuinely built rectangular structure sitting almost exactly where the text describes. Before going any further, it's worth asking the question any honest telling of this story has to address directly. Was Gilgamesh even a real historical person? Because if he's purely a literary invention with no more physical reality than any other myth, then there's no actual body to bury, no genuine tomb to build, and the rectangular anomaly in the riverbed is simply a coincidence in the mud, nothing more. The honest answer turns out to be more interesting than a flat yes or no. Among the surviving cuneiform documents from ancient Mesopotamia is a text scholars refer to as the Sumerian King List, a catalogue of rulers of the early Mesopotamian cities stretching back into a period remote enough that legend and verifiable history blur together. On that list, recorded plainly among the kings of Uruk during the early dynastic period, roughly around 2700 BCE, appears the name Gilgamesh, listed not as a god or a myth, but as a king, a ruler of a real city, situated alongside other rulers whose historical existence archaeologists have independently corroborated through other evidence. That detail changes the picture considerably, because it suggests the hero of the world's oldest surviving epic may have genuinely begun as a real person who sat on a throne in a mud-brick palace, governed a city, fought wars, and eventually died and needed to be buried somewhere specific. What emerges from that isn't a fairy tale invented from nothing, but a legend that appears to have grown, layer by layer, around a real human core, which is how legendary figures often actually develop historically. A real king lives, does something remarkable or terrible or both, and across the generations that follow, stories about him accumulate and grow until the historical man is effectively buried under centuries of poetic embellishment, in much the same way his physical body was eventually buried beneath a river. The superhuman strength, the two-thirds divine ancestry, the towering, larger-than-life stature described throughout the epic, these read as the accumulated additions of generations of poets and scribes, the kind of exaggeration that naturally builds up when a culture wants its founding heroic king to be something more than simply mortal. Strip those poetic additions away, and what plausibly remains underneath is a genuinely powerful ruler of Uruk, remembered vividly enough that scribes were still faithfully copying and recopying his story onto clay tablets well over 1,000 years after he likely walked the earth. And if that underlying man was real, then his actual burial was presumably real too, and if the surrounding oral and written tradition preserved even a distorted fragment of what genuinely happened to his remains, then the strange, oddly specific detail about a diverted river and a tomb built in an exposed channel might not be pure invention after all. That's the thought that has kept this particular mystery alive for so long, not the giant, and not any supposed monster slaying, but the strangely specific, strangely practical engineering detail buried inside an otherwise mythic account. Because it's a genuinely odd thing to simply invent from nothing. Poets naturally exaggerate strength, height, and divine ancestry. That's a well-understood common feature of heroic literature across cultures. But why would a poet fabricate a specific civil engineering procedure? Damming a major river, draining a section of its bed, constructing a structure in the exposed mud, and then deliberately releasing the water again isn't really the language of typical myth-making. It reads considerably more like a fragmented, garbled memory of an actual undertaken project than like a poet's flourish, and that's precisely why, for well over a century, this particular passage has drawn a specific kind of determined searcher to southern Iraq, the sort of person inclined to read an ancient poem not purely as literature, but partly as a map. The problem that has always stopped such searchers cold, though, is straightforward. You genuinely cannot dig up a legend on a hunch. You can't take a shovel to a 4,000-year-old poem and reasonably expect the ground to cooperate on command. The ancient city of Uruk, known today as Warka, is an enormous field of eroded earthen mounds baking under the southern Iraqi sun. At its historical peak, it may well have been the largest human settlement on the planet, home to tens of thousands of people and ringed by substantial walls. Walls the epic itself explicitly boasts that Gilgamesh personally built. Over the following millennia, that great city gradually collapsed inward on itself, its mud-brick architecture slowly melting back into the very earth it had been made from, until the whole sprawling metropolis became a series of low, indistinguishable mounded ridges that look, to an untrained eye, essentially identical to the surrounding desert. The Euphrates, meanwhile, did what rivers naturally do over long stretches of time. It wandered, gradually shifting its course across the centuries, abandoning old channels and carving new ones, leaving behind buried, silted-up ribbons of former riverbed threading through and around the dead city's remains. Somewhere within all of that shifted, buried landscape, under some unknown depth of accumulated sediment, the ancient text claims a tomb was built. Excavating blindly across a site that enormous, trench by trench, hunting for one specific structure, could realistically take a century and still turn up nothing at all, the archaeological equivalent of being handed a poem describing a single needle and told to locate it somewhere across a landscape the size of a small country. For generations, then, the tomb of Gilgamesh remained exactly what most serious skeptics said it was. A beautiful, evocative story with no practical way to actually test it. You could choose to believe it or dismiss it, but you genuinely couldn't look, because there was no available method that let researchers see meaningfully beneath the surface without physically tearing that surface apart, and nobody had the time, funding, or sufficient justification to excavate the whole of Uruk purely on the strength of a hunch buried inside an ancient poem. That situation changed once the available tools changed, because while you still can't dig up a legend on a whim, it turns out you genuinely can map the ground it's rumored to be buried within. By the early years of this century, a research team arrived at Uruk carrying instruments capable of doing something no shovel ever could: reading what lay beneath the surface without disturbing that surface at all, effectively letting them walk across the dead city and see through it, tracing buried walls, vanished canals, and the ghost of the ancient street plan, all of it still physically present just a few feet down, invisible to the naked eye but not to sensitive instruments. The central tool in that 2003 survey, conducted by a German Archaeological Institute team, was the magnetometer, and understanding why what it found mattered so much requires understanding what the instrument actually measures. A magnetometer, at its core, reads something invisible and present everywhere: the Earth's own magnetic field. That field isn't perfectly uniform. It flexes, dips, and strengthens subtly in response to what's physically present beneath your feet. The crucial fact for archaeology is that things humans build disturb that field in small, measurable, consistent ways. A mud brick wall, a fired hearth, a kiln, a packed clay floor, or the accumulated fill of an old, silted-in ditch, each of these carries a slightly different magnetic signature than the undisturbed natural soil surrounding it. Fire in particular leaves a mark that persists for millennia, since the process of heating and cooling clay locks a faint, permanent magnetism directly into the material. A city that once fired its bricks, dug its canals, and packed its courtyards leaves behind a hidden, lasting pattern in the ground. Not treasure exactly, but a genuine fingerprint of deliberate human activity pressed into the Earth's own magnetism. The instrument that reads this pattern looks almost disappointingly ordinary. A lightweight frame carried at a normal walking pace, a sensor held a fixed distance above the soil, and a small onboard computer logging thousands of readings every second. The survey team moved across Uruk in tight, parallel lines, back and forth, meter by meter, day after day, under punishing desert heat. There was nothing visually dramatic about the actual labor involved: no dust clouds, no open trenches, just a handful of researchers methodically walking a grid across a landscape of low earthen ridges, quietly recording numbers while the buried ruins around them gave away nothing to the naked eye. And yet, once those millions of individual readings were compiled and rendered as a single composite image, bright where the magnetic field read strong and dark where it read weak, the dead city genuinely came back into visible shape on a screen. What emerged wasn't vague rubble or ambiguous suggestion, it was an actual plan. Streets ran in clearly straight lines across the rendered image. The great enclosing wall of Uruk, the very one the epic explicitly boasts about, appeared as a sweeping, continuous band. Inside that boundary, the survey traced the outlines of individual buildings, courtyards, and foundations, the dense physical footprint of a place that had once genuinely held tens of thousands of living people. And threading through all of it, unmistakable once you knew what to look for, were the canals, since Uruk had historically been as much a city built around water as around mudbrick, laced throughout with irrigation channels and gardens, and the magnetometer traced every one of them, their long silted beds glowing faintly against the surrounding undisturbed earth. For the first time, researchers were effectively viewing the full street plan of one of the earliest true cities on Earth without moving a single grain of sand. That map alone would have thoroughly justified the entire survey expedition on its own merits. But it was one particular feature that would, in time, draw far more public attention than the researchers involved ever actually intended. The survey's coverage extended out beyond the built edges of the ancient city itself, and there, within a broad, dark ribbon, the instruments identified as a former abandoned course of the Euphrates, a channel the river had once flowed through and later left behind. The magnetometer registered something that didn't read like a simple canal and didn't read like an ordinary building foundation either. It registered as a distinct rectangular anomaly, set directly within the traced outline of that vanished river channel, with edges regular enough to plausibly suggest deliberate human construction rather than the natural, irregular fill patterns left behind by moving water alone. On its own, a rectangular anomaly detected somewhere in southern Iraq isn't inherently remarkable. Uruk is genuinely full of buried rectangles, because Uruk was an actual city, and cities are made of exactly that kind of geometry. A magnetometer detects shapes, not names, stories, or identities. It can't tell researchers who built something, when, why, or whether anyone was ever buried inside it. It can only indicate that the Earth in one spot is arranged differently than the Earth around it, in a way that has the geometry of deliberate human intention. A cautious archaeologist looking at a rectangle in an old riverbed would reasonably think, interesting, worth noting, one anomaly among hundreds, nothing more. But someone already familiar with the Gilgamesh burial account would feel a genuine chill, because the strangest, most specific detail in that account, the one element least likely for a poet to simply invent, is this. The hero wasn't buried within the city, and wasn't buried on high ground, and wasn't buried in an ordinary field. He was buried directly in the exposed bed of the river. And here, roughly 4,000 years later, was a purely instrumental survey that had done nothing more than passively read the ambient magnetism of the ground, with no particular agenda and no legend specifically in mind, simply a systematic grid and a sensor, and it had flagged a genuinely rectangular, structure-like anomaly sitting in precisely the kind of location the ancient account describes, an abandoned channel of the river, a distinct shape appearing exactly where, according to the old text, a shape shouldn't naturally occur at all. The correspondence between the oldest substantial story humanity possesses and the coldest, most neutral scientific instrument available wasn't perfect, and it definitely wasn't proof of anything on its own. The researchers involved were consistently careful never to claim otherwise in their published findings. But the correspondence was genuinely there, a real, documented alignment between literature and physical survey data, and once word of that alignment became public, the careful scientific caveats, the crucial distinction between a shape and a confirmed identity, were quickly the first things a much less careful retelling chose to forget entirely. A real, if modest, fragment of genuine information had entered public circulation. An actual survey, an actual magnetic anomaly, and an actual specific detail in an ancient text that happened to line up with it. From that small, honest kernel of real archaeology, something considerably larger and less honest was about to grow. A story involving hidden tombs, giant bones, and secret military operations supposedly sent to seize a body from the mud under cover of war. The truth of what the magnetometer found was quiet and unresolved. What people built on top of it online was neither. To see how far the popular retelling drifted from the facts, start with the one question the survey itself could never answer: whether anyone had actually gone down into that channel to look. Nobody had. That's the part the loudest versions of this story consistently leave out. There was no excavation. No trench was ever cut into the old channel, no shaft sunk toward the rectangle, No gloved hand ever brushed silt from a threshold. The anomaly was mapped, catalogued, and almost immediately orphaned, for a reason that's neither mysterious nor sinister, though it's been dressed up online as both: the calendar. The survey was completed in the opening months of 2003, and by that same spring, southern Iraq was an active war zone. The invasion began in March. Whatever plans, researchers had to return with proper permits, and crews dissolved into checkpoints, curfews, and years of instability that made careful, permitted archaeology all but impossible. Nobody brings a delicate excavation to a landscape where the roads are dangerous and antiquities elsewhere are being actively looted. So the rectangle stayed exactly where it was, untouched and unproven. In that ordinary, fully explicable silence, born of an actual war rather than any conspiracy, a rumor found room to grow. To a certain kind of storyteller, an unexcavated anomaly isn't an unfinished, normal research question. It's a locked door, and a locked door, they'll insist, is only ever locked because somebody already got there first and has something to hide. So the story grew a dramatic second act it had never earned. The claim shifted from "the war interrupted planned research" to something far more sensational: that soldiers had been quietly redirected to the site, that a body had been lifted from the channel under cover of darkness, and that the whole affair had been buried under official denial. To sell that, the story needed a body, ideally a spectacular one. So images began circulating: enormous skeletons half exposed in loose dirt, a human skull the size of a boulder, small excavators dwarfed beside a rib cage the size of a boat's frame, captioned as "the actual bones of the giant Gilgamesh, finally recovered." They are, without ambiguity, fabricated. Not disputed by rival researchers, simply cleanly fabricated from the start. The most widely circulated of these images traces back to a digital art and photo manipulation competition, where participants were invited to create convincing visual hoaxes purely for fun. Several winning entries, genuinely clever and seamlessly composited, escaped that original contest entirely and began circulating with new, invented captions attached. None were ever photographed at Uruk. None depict any real excavation. The bones never existed as bones. They existed as digitally composited pixels layered over ordinary photographs from entirely unrelated dig sites in other countries. The supposed military recovery, the midnight extraction, the classified crate, none of it has ever been supported by a single genuine document, named witness or verifiable trace. It's a narrative that structurally requires the tomb to have actually been opened, and the tomb, as far as any documented evidence shows, has never been opened by anyone. Strip all of the fabricated material away entirely, and what genuinely remains is smaller, stranger, and considerably more interesting than any giant skeleton story ever managed to be. What remains is a real, still unresolved puzzle with two entirely honest sides to it. On one side sits that genuinely unsettling correspondence. The underlying textual tradition doesn't simply say something generic like "buried near the river," a detail almost any storyteller might casually guess at. It specifies burial within the deliberately diverted bed of the river itself, beneath water that was intentionally restored afterward, an unusually specific, oddly technical burial method that doesn't especially resemble the kind of detail a later inventor would casually dream up, and its apparent match with a genuinely real structure sitting in a genuinely real abandoned channel feels, at minimum, less like sheer coincidence and more like some kind of preserved echo. On the other side sits the flat, appropriately unglamorous truth of what the instrument itself can actually tell us. A magnetometer reads shapes. It doesn't read names, dates, or original intentions. A rectangular anomaly sitting in an ancient floodplain could plausibly be a tomb, but it could just as easily be a warehouse, a temple platform, a granary, a kiln, or simply an ordinary house the river happened to swallow and bury roughly 4,000 years ago. Southern Mesopotamia is genuinely dense with buried rectangular structures, and the overwhelming majority of them turn out to be entirely unremarkable once actually examined. The statistical odds that any single unexcavated anomaly specifically represents the resting place of the most famous individual figure from the world's oldest surviving epic are, by simple probability alone, genuinely quite long, and the only real way to meaningfully shorten those odds is to actually excavate the site. Nobody has. That leaves the story exactly where the original 2003 survey left it, and exactly where any honest telling of it has to conclude, with a door still firmly shut. The magnetic survey map is real. The instrument used was real. The rectangular anomaly sitting in that old river channel is real, and it presumably remains there right now, under the same accumulated silt, holding the same basic shape it held when the sensor first passed over it more than 20 years ago. And sitting alongside that anomaly is a roughly 4,000-year-old text that points, quite specifically, at exactly that kind of location and effectively claims a great king lies beneath the river. The most genuinely extraordinary part of this entire story was never really about a giant. It isn't about a stolen body or a secret shipping crate or a hidden military conspiracy. It's the simple, slightly vertiginous fact that the oldest substantial story we possess describes a burial method nobody previously had any strong reason to think could actually be true, and that a scientific instrument with absolutely no knowledge of that story walked systematically across the ground and detected something sitting in the very location the ancient text specifically named. And then a real war began, and the researchers had to leave, and in the more than 2 decades since, nobody has ever gone back down to actually look. The mystery survives today not because it was ever deliberately locked away, but because it was genuinely abandoned mid-sentence, and nobody has yet returned to finish that sentence properly. It's entirely possible that structure turns out to be nothing especially significant at all, perhaps an ordinary merchant storeroom that flooded during some unrecorded seasonal event, and that opening it would reveal little more than broken pottery, ordinary river mud, and a useful lesson about how easily we read our own hopeful narratives into ambiguous ground. Or it's possible, though far from confirmed, that it's genuinely something closer to what a roughly 4,000-year-old poem once promised, still waiting quietly in the dark for the day proper excavation finally resumes. The genuinely remarkable part of all this is simply that the underlying question remains authentically open, not closed off by any real cover-up, and not definitively settled by any of the circulating hoaxes either, just honestly and patiently unresolved, sitting there in the flat, sun-baked landscape where some of the very first cities on Earth once stood.